and welcome to the Catholic Intellectual. I'm your host, Alexander Chenda. Please hit the subscribe button if you haven't done that already. And today I'm very happy to be joined by Dr. Robert Koons and his son, Ben Koons, to talk about their conversion story from Protestantism to the Catholic Church. So maybe if they'd like to give a brief introduction of themselves and what they do before we start, that'd be good.
Okay, yeah, I teach philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin, where I've been teaching for almost 34 years now. And yeah, grew up mostly in Houston, Texas, born up in Minnesota.
I'm Ben Koons, Rob Koons' son. I'm a graduate student in philosophy and classics at Yale. I'm in my third year there, mostly doing Aristotle. This is actually my first semester teaching, so I've got another 33 to go.
Yeah.
And I grew up in Austin, where I was born and raised.
Okay, great. Well, I thought we could start the conversation from, I guess, where the conversion journey began for both of you. So since I know Dr. Koons was the first one to convert, I thought maybe we could start with him and where that journey to conversion started, and then you could go ahead and talk about where it started for you, Ben.
Okay, yeah. So I was raised in the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, which is the more conservative branch of the American Lutheran Church. Very pious parents, wonderful parents, really, that baptized me, passed along to me a love for the Bible and for Christ. And so I went to Michigan State University up north. I think it was during the first year, maybe it might be the second now, but one of my roommates was ex-Lutheran who'd become Anglican, and he was sort of moving towards Anglo-Catholicism. He actually ended up being the Anglican bishop of Milwaukee eventually, but at the time he was my roommate, and he got a bunch of us together to read some of the church fathers, some of the early theologians of the church. I think we read Cyprian, which is kind of an odd choice, but we read several others, and that was sort of what planted the seed for me, because the narrative that I'd been told it was that the Reformation was needed to correct some relatively late errors in the medieval church, nominalism and Beale and all these people, and that Luther and Melanchthon and the others were basically just restoring the church to its earlier purity, not going all the way back to the apostles, but really the patristic church too, the church of really until very late into the Middle Ages. So I expected when I was reading these church fathers that they would sound like Lutherans, right? Because that's what Luther had done, is it brought us back to that original understanding. And I found that they didn't sound very Lutheran at all, really. They didn't have anything like sola scriptura. They, of course, took for granted that the church was an ongoing society, grounded in bishops, and their doctrine of salvation, justification, and so on was not familiar to me at all. It wasn't the sort of faith alone, alien righteousness sort of story that I've been told. And so that created a lot of cognitive dissonance in me for quite a while. I ended up sort of moving towards an Anglo-Catholic direction myself for a while. But then I guess, again, my story is a little bit complex. It took 30 years, right, to get me from there to actually joining the church when I was 50. And so I read the Council of Trent on Justification, because I thought that was sort of the crucial issue. And I think at that point, I didn't really understand it. I read things there and it sounded wrong to me. It sounded like it was really contradicting what Paul was saying. And so I thought, okay, so, it's more complicated than I thought, but still the Reformation maybe was needed in order to correct this one significant error. And I kind of thought of myself then as not Catholic, but a kind of fellow traveler, right? Someone who saw the Catholic Church as genuinely the true church, but in need of correction. And the Reformation was a sort of emergency revolt, so to speak, or protest against that. And so that I reached a kind of equilibrium point of that sort and went back to the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, for a long time. And then it wasn't really until the late 90s that things started bubbling up to the surface again through a couple things. One was this joint declaration between Lutherans and Catholics on justification, which was a very flawed document in various ways, but it did put the issue back on the table for me to consider, and made me realize that things were more complicated than I had realized. My understanding of it when I was in my 20s was really inadequate. And then similarly, there were a couple articles in First Things magazine that I've subscribed to religiously for all these years about justification and grace that also reinforced this idea that I don't think I really understand this very well. So that kind of sparked a 8 or 9 year process of study, really, where I studied a lot of the church fathers again, really trying to figure out what exactly were they saying, especially on justification. Reread the Council of Trent, which I now understood a lot better, because in the meantime, I guess this is another part of the story, I'd begun reading a lot of Thomas Aquinas. And this was not because of any interest in the Catholic Church per se, or dissatisfaction with Lutheranism, but just because I'd been teaching logic and I'd looked for some interesting arguments and decided to use the Summa, the 5 ways. And once I was doing that as a teacher, I realized, wait, these 5 ways are actually quite interesting. And so I ended up writing some articles on arguments for God's existence that were inspired by Thomas. So he'd become a much more significant part of my life. I probably should mention that somewhere in about the same time, actually a little bit earlier maybe, I was at a conference in Toulouse, France, on linguistics. It had nothing to do with theology, but had some free time, wandered around the town, sort of stumbled into this church. There was this shrine over in the corner, very beautiful shrine. Turned out to be Thomas Aquinas' shrine. And at that point, although I was still, staunchly Lutheran in many ways, I was open to the intercession of the saints. That made sense to me. So I spent actually a couple hours there with Thomas in his shrine. And ever since then, he's been there in my life in lots of ways. So I'm sure that he has been praying for me. So anyway, let's see, go back to the thread of the story. Very intensive study. And I eventually reached a point at which I found myself really being pulled into a Catholic faith, recognizing that, that Luther's and Melanchthon's account of justification really wasn't that plausible. It didn't match up with the Bible very well. And so I thought, well, all right, so maybe I'm just being attracted to Catholicism because I'm a philosopher and I have this kind of contrarian mindset, right? Where you're always kind of testing yourself against other ideas. And so what I should do is I'll sit down and I'll write down the pro-Catholic position. And then once I've gotten that out of my system, then the contrarianism will kick in and I'll be able to knock that down and then I'll be able to stay with the Lutheran Church. Because really, I was hoping I could stay a Lutheran. That would have been far more convenient in lots of ways. And I was not dissatisfied with it. So anyway, I did this, and it ended up being about a 95-page thesis, so to speak. And after I finished it, I looked at it and I said, I can't knock this down. This is actually quite compelling. I wrote it all with myself as the intended audience. So it was never really intended to share it with anybody else, actually, but it ended up persuading me. And so then, what could I do? I now believed that the Catholic Church was the true church, and I was not in fellowship with it. And so I had to fix that. So it was difficult. My parents never have understood this. It was very difficult for them. My mom, who passed away this last year, felt that she must have done something wrong in raising me. And it's like, no, you did a great job, actually. You really laid the foundations for this without realizing it. So anyway, I joined the church. Like I said, I was 50 years old in 2007. And one of the slowest and most reluctant converts of all time, I think. And I've been extremely pleasantly surprised, actually, with the results. Didn't expect, frankly, a lot in terms of my personal life, but it's been tremendous. And I found that my fellow Catholics much more lively in their faith than I expected, much deeper in many cases in their theology, and obviously the intercession of the saints, the connections with Mary, the Sacrament of Penance has been huge in my life, and of course, the Mass. I mean, it's everything that I liked about the Lutheran view of the sacraments on steroids, right? And intensified in the Catholic Church. So I've been very pleased with the results. So sorry for the very long short answer, I know, but it was a 30-year process, so it was kind of hard to encapsulate.
Thank you. So Ben, how did it start for you? Did your dad's conversion have a role to play in your conversion, or was it a kind of more of a separate journey?
It was very much sparked by my father's conversion. I remember as a small child, I had grown up, in a very similar household to my own father, being raised in the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, being taught, all the Bible stories at a very young age, and having a very strong sense of the presence of Christ throughout my childhood. And also, I never having any sort of doubts in the fact of the resurrection. I mean, I think, you think about like some of these great tenets of the Christian faith. They were never in doubt. And I think in some ways that played a huge role in the attractiveness of the Catholic faith, that there was such a strident defense and belief in these great dogmas of Christianity. But in high school was when my dad converted, when I was just going into high school. And I mean, at the time I was 14 years old. So, the differences between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church, they were not apparent to me. I didn't really know any Catholics growing up in Austin. And so, my dad becoming one, I mean, in some ways, I really thought of Catholicism as just an ethnic thing. I didn't realize that like people could convert for intellectual reasons. I thought, this is something you're born into, and not something that you come to accept. But yeah, so my dad's conversion when I was 14 was a big influence on me. But mostly in the sense that I thought, well, I need to figure this out. It wasn't, I thought, well, I'm old enough at this point that I can't just convert on the basis of my father's conversion. Like I have a will of my own, I have an intellect of my own, and I can't just say, well, he's done all the intellectual legwork, so I can just defer to him. So I really began asking a lot of questions of my dad, just trying to understand what was the Catholic view on different things. And I never had the sense that, you were trying to convert me in particular. But anytime I would ask a question, I would get the response. And I thought to myself, when I go to college, that's when I'll really figure this out. That's when you discover yourself. So I'll figure out this big question when I go to college. And that, I mean, that ended up being true. But in high school, I remember there were a couple of intellectual experiences that I think were really important. So one was that we had this sort of Bible study at the church called Deep. And I mean, it wasn't very orthodox in a lot of ways. There were a lot of doubting Thomases in the group, and like agnosticism was probably like the majority position, honestly. But it was actually very good for me, I think, because that was really where I was put through the crucible in terms of defending, the crucifixion, the resurrection, the historicity of our Lord Jesus Christ. And I became like very deeply convinced on an intellectual level of the truth of the Christian religion. And then I remember going in my later years in high school to what I call Plato Camp, which is Witherspoon Institute's Moral Life and Intellectual Tradition seminar for high school students. And I remember meeting a lot of young Catholic high schoolers who knew the faith very, very well. And I'd never met anyone like that before, and being deeply impressed by them. And at the time, I was starting to get much more interested in pro-life, pro-marriage causes. And that I think really set me up for a kind of sympathy with a lot of Catholics. So that way, when I went into college, I looked at the pro-life group. Lo and behold, it's almost all Catholic, and so that was a big witness for me, actually. I thought, well, there's actually not that many Protestants in these groups, and the Protestants that are in these groups are on their way to becoming Catholic. And I thought, well, why is that? Like, I mean, these are the great moral causes of our time. Why is it that they're not more of my fellow Protestants in these groups? But so then when I went to college, I got very involved with the Evangelical Fellowship at Princeton, and that was important because it really it got me thinking about prayer in a very different way that wasn't so sentimental in the way that it had been for when I was younger, and taking the moral life much more seriously, trying to form virtues. Okay, but I'll skip ahead. So I think really when I think about like my own conversion, what are the really important aspects of it? One was I took on Marian devotion very early on, even before I thought the Catholic faith was true, because like my father, I thought intercession of the saints makes sense. A special role for Mary makes sense, given that she's the mother of Christ, given the what our Lord says on the cross at the crucifixion. And so I began praying the Rosary, asking Our Lady for her intercession. I remember at one point I was praying for a girl's conversion, and I didn't really pray for it very much myself, and I just said, well, Mary, you can handle this prayer. And I remember finding out a month later that the girl had converted, and I thought, wow, like she's very powerful, this Our Lady. She's a very powerful intercessor. And then another thing was going to Rome. So I went on a pilgrimage with some Catholics at Princeton to Rome. I was still a Lutheran at this point. And I remember there was this one part that was really impressed me, was when we went to the heavenly stairs in Rome, where they have, the steps to Pontius Pilate's palace, which our Lord, crawled up during his passion. And I'd known that this was actually very important in Luther's falling away from the Catholic faith, was going up these steps and going to Rome and seeing what Rome was like. And that going up these steps and doing the penance, it caused him to sort of see, oh, this whole like works righteousness is like so totally corrupt. It had entirely the opposite effect on me. And I just, I came to love penance. I said, this is a way of really uniting oneself with Christ in a way that is not really open to a Lutheran. In that way, like being a part of the crucifixion, being a part of the passion. So I think like the moment at which I knew that the Catholic, like that I had accepted the Catholic faith, was when I went to Baltimore for a trip, and I saw that there was this really beautiful Gothic church outside the hotel I was staying in. And I thought, oh, I'll go and I'll pray my Rosary over there in this beautiful Gothic church, and it'll be great. And I went over there. This is Maryland; it's the land of Mary. And so I went over to this Gothic church, and I realized, oh, it's not a Catholic church; it's a Methodist church. And suddenly I was like, I don't really want to go there. And I thought to myself, it's very weird. Why not? Like, you're not Catholic. What does it matter? Like, where you stay? Like, no, I don't really want to go there. I was like, well, why not? It's like, well, because our Lord, he's not present in the Eucharist there. It's not, it's not the Catholic Church. And so after that, after that, it was really just a matter of going through RCIA and entering into the Catholic Church. And one of the things that whole process showed me too was really the importance of intellectual humility when in conversion. Because I remember going into college thinking, I'm going to thoroughly research every single theological debate between Protestants and Catholics, and in a very objective, impartial manner, I'm going to figure out what are the arguments in favor of each side, what are the sources in favor of each side, and then I'm going to adjudicate. It's going to take me all 4 years. It's going to maybe take even longer than that. It took my dad 30 years. So, it's going to be a very difficult process. And what I realized in converting is that that's so totally impossible, really. I mean, it's impossible, at least for most people. And you just have to take it on faith in the church. You have to come to believe in what the church teaches. You have to have that kind of confidence that you're not going to come to a point where you find out, oh, there's this one doctrine that the church got wrong. And I remember there was one doctrine where I thought, very late in the process of RCI, where I thought, oh, I don't know if I accept that. That seems really wrong. Like it was actually the sacrifice of the Mass. And I thought, that seems really, contrary to the teaching of St. Paul in Hebrews.
Mm-hmm.
But I think having that kind of humility is really essential to being able to convert.
Yeah. That intellectual humility is an interesting point, because I was talking to Dr. Koons in preparation for this conversation. And one of the things that he mentioned was something akin to that, which is just kind of like the epistemic weight of Protestantism, because all the weight for true belief, I guess, falls on the individual. Whereas in Catholicism, you're relying on this tradition of like great saints and holy people going back to Christ. And it's that tradition that helps you to know that this is true through the magisterium of the church.
Yeah. I mean, what Ben says is exactly right. And especially looking back, when I read the thing which just got published this last year, it's a little embarrassing, really, because I think I'm trying to do this impossible task, and I'm a layperson, right? I didn't have the training to do this, but it was way Luther's fault that I had to try, right? Because he's the one who'd said that it's basically up to each one of you to figure out if you're going to the right church, and the only way to check if you're going to the right church is to see if they've got all the doctrines in the Bible correct, and that's an impossible burden, and I tried to fulfill it, but in the end, as Ben says, I couldn't really do it. And so, although I think I reached a point where I didn't have any reasonable doubts anymore, I did have doubts, actually, just because, as he said, I mean, I may have missed something. Maybe I didn't analyze this quite correctly. So it took a few years, actually, of actual, immersion in the church to where there weren't even any doubts anymore, right? And I mean, then looking back now, it's like, why was that so hard? Actually, it should have been easy, but it wasn't. Actually, it was extremely difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I imagine that's the case, just knowing myself and having had certain doubts at times, being born a Catholic, about my faith, and just the way in which the virtue of faith works, and the way in which God gives the grace of faith, and that it is something that has to be accepted. And then it seems like there's something there that God really wants us to trust him. It's not the kind of situation where you feel like you can grasp onto the whole thing, but it's really a situation that feels more like surrender. And it's always going to feel like that if we're going after God, I think, because that's what it means to have faith. It means to kind of, like Bishop Barron would say, kind of at the edges of the intellect, of what our intellectual life can do, to say, I surrender, I believe God has spoken, I believe that this is true, and I'm willing to sort of surrender at the outer bounds of what my intellect can do.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, that's one thing I did understand, I think, which is that, I mean, there were lots, at the time I converted, there were still lots of doctrines, especially about Mary, Assumption, and Immaculate Conception, that I said, I have no idea whether these are true or not, but the church says so, so I'll go ahead and accept it, so yeah, I think you have to, as you say, you have to have that kind of docility at some point.
Mm-hmm. So I could ask each of you, what was the most difficult thing to overcome coming into church, if there was one, like really like big difficulty on the journey? If anything comes to mind for that. Well, maybe I could actually narrow it to just, at least in this section, talking about what was it like kind of leaving behind the church community that you'd known and loved with the Lutheran community, in order to join a new community, because I imagine that was quite difficult, as well as knowing that you have the rest of your family who are still Lutheran, and so you kind of separated yourself, I guess I mentioned, in a way by converting. So how was it dealing with that
Right.
for each of you?
Yeah, right. So that's one thing I thought of outside the family has to do with just divisions and errors that are in the church. I'd read things like people like Hans Kung and things like that. And I thought, well, there's some really freaky stuff going on in there. I'm not sure that I'm joining the right team here. So that was a bit of a worry. But yeah, on the family side, it was difficult because my daughters were already basically grown. Ben was in that kind of awkward stage where I couldn't just say, "Hey, you're my child, let's go." And but he was too young to do it on his own, so that was complicated. My wife didn't join the church, so we've had to kind of renegotiate all of that. It's not always easy either. And my parents, it was very difficult for them. It still has been, I think. But I think eventually they accepted it and realized that I hadn't really lost my faith, right? I still was trusting in Christ as my Savior. That's the main thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult mostly in terms of my family, because in college I had already had a number of Catholic friends. I had several Protestant friends, although actually many of them subsequently became Catholic. There was a whole string of conversions later. But the biggest difficulty I was with my own family. Just I think the Marian devotion is a big problem, and the claims of the church to be the one true church. It's difficult teaching. And the submission to papal teaching is another great difficulty. So that would mean those the big issues with converting is that people think you've gone off the deep end. And actually, after I converted, I became very serious about discerning a vocation to religious life. So visiting monasteries and considering becoming a Benedictine. So that was another even further, probably bigger difficulty, rather than just becoming Catholic, was going off and being a monk and spending one's whole life with this Princeton education, just chanting the Psalms.
That would have been a very radical decision to go off and join a monastery after converting. And I imagine something difficult for family or friends who are Protestant to understand, given that they don't really have a monastic tradition that they practice. That's been lost in the Protestant church. So definitely, to say, it seems like it takes a lot of courage to make this sort of step and to say, like, I'm willing to leave everything in order to follow Christ and what I believe Christ is calling me to do and what I believe is the truth. And then to go join his church, especially a church that's in many ways a big mess. So.
Yeah. Now the verse about how you got to hate your mother and father and all that. I mean, that verse was relevant because in the end, one has to make the choice: is it God or one's family that's going to be the most important thing?
Yeah.
I mean, who's your mother? Is it Mary, or is it your earthly mother? And hopefully it can be both, but Mary has to come first.
Yeah. That's really what, like, every Christian ought to believe, right, about what our faith commits us to, I guess, right? Is we have to be willing to sacrifice everything and give everything for the sake of Christ in the end. So, well.
Yeah, when I was converting, I read Newman's little novel. It's kind of a autobiographical novel, Gain and Loss, and it's really about that issue. And so it was very moving for me to read that while I was going through it myself.
what were maybe some of the more pleasant surprises or the really attractive things of the church? I guess intellectually, in terms of community, or maybe the security of having the sort of tradition that helps you to know what's true.
Yeah. I mean, I've become a lot more Thomist in my thinking over the years, and that's been great because then there's this, this international community of people, and we still disagree about a lot of things, but there's a tremendous amount of common ground that you can work with, and that makes it really very rewarding. So that's been really good. Again, the sacraments are great. I mean, the Mass, every time I go to Mass, it's just such a wonderful experience. And the sacrament of penance and reconciliation. I mean, I'd known beforehand. I mean, intellectually, that sounds like a good idea, right? But then when you actually have to do it, right, you actually have to verbalize with another human being, right, who represents Christ, your actual sins. It's a whole different. Really, it's like an experience I had no idea how liberating it could actually be, how rewarding it could be.
Mm-hmm. And were you attending like Catholic services or Catholic events before you converted? Or did that really only come after you had kind of made the intellectual conversion?
Yeah, for me, it was pretty much really only afterwards. I mean, occasionally I would go to Mass. And I mean, on the surface, it didn't actually seem that difficult for me in a sense, because the Novus Ordo Mass and a fairly traditional Lutheran service are pretty similar, actually, similar structure. Of course, they're all in vernacular and so on. So that actually, it made it easier for me, actually. But no, I wasn't really, not until I got into the confirmation class that I really started attending, regularly.
But for you, Ben, it sounded like you were already kind of a part of the Catholic community, at least on campus in Princeton to some extent, before you converted?
I was already starting to go to masses
Mm-hmm.
before I had even converted. I mean, even before I started RCA, I was going to mass because I thought, well, I don't know what's going on here. It could be that transubstantiation is true. At the very least, as a Lutheran, I believed in the real presence, and I didn't see any reason as a Lutheran to deny that the Catholics could also have the real presence in the Eucharist. So I was already going to that. I guess coming from a Lutheran church that has in many ways gone even further in terms of modernizing the liturgy, the Novus Ordo struck me as like very liturgical at the time. And it had a lot of the elements of the Lutheran liturgy that I had really liked actually as a child, and fewer elements of the bits I didn't really like as much. I mean, as a child, I never really liked the sermon all that much, and so I kind of was, I was happy that there's homilies were generally shorter, and I guess for me the big surprise has been the sacraments as well. I would say going into it, I sort of thought, well, I understand the power of these sacraments, but I didn't really think, oh, they're going to have kind of tangible effects, or oh, you can actually sort of have a sense of the power of the sacraments, and that doesn't always happen. I remember my first confession, that didn't happen. I had a great desire before converting to go to confession and rid myself of all my sins, and I thought, oh, this is going to be this great feeling afterwards. But I remember feeling just incredibly depressed, actually. And I called my dad about it, and he told me, oh, I felt sort of the same way, and I mean, maybe that is actually the power of the sacrament of penance, that you kind of suddenly have once you've confessed them, you suddenly have a sense of the gravity of what you've done. And yeah, I guess I didn't really I didn't expect to start going to the traditional Latin Mass at all before I converted. So that was a big surprise for me as well, is that the impact of that in my own life.
Yeah. I imagine that'd be a surprise to many Catholics as well, because I think a lot of Catholics thought, especially around Vatican II, that, with the Novus Ordo, we'd be more attractive to Protestants, because, well, it would seem more like what they're used to already. But you're someone that I know you pretty much go exclusively to the Tridentine liturgy, right? And the more traditional sacraments and liturgy. So what is it about that you like and that drove you towards it?
Well, I actually didn't go to a single traditional Latin Mass until after I converted. So I remember Easter Sunday, I was received into the church. I received my first communion, my confirmation, and then the next week, Low Sunday, I went to my first, TLM, and I didn't like it at all. And I went the week after that. I still didn't like it. I couldn't follow it. They had all these books, and it was like really confusing, and it's just like totally baffled at what was going on, and I kept going. And it was really, the reason I kept going was because I thought to myself, the reason I became a Catholic is because I believe that this is the traditional Christian faith. This was the faith that was handed on by the apostles through the apostolic succession to the bishops that are in communion with Rome. And this liturgy is the traditional Christian liturgy, at least there's other rites, so I don't want to say that the Roman rite's the only one, but for the Roman rite, this is the traditional Christian liturgy. And so I felt intellectually like I have to come to like this, and I have to go to this liturgy, even if I don't like it, even if it's not pleasant or enjoyable. But I kept going, and I think what I found was it's not a mass that's really conformed to men. It's a mass that conforms men to it. And I found just great richness in it that I hadn't expected beforehand. I was actually a little bit scandalized when I was a Lutheran and I learned about the traditional Latin Mass, because I didn't realize that it was the only Mass until the 1960s. For some reason, as a Lutheran, I just assumed, when we translated the liturgy into the vernacular in the 1500s, presumably the Catholics did the same thing soon thereafter, right? Because it's modernity. Why would you have Latin liturgy? But it's been a huge influence, I think, on my spiritual life, and I think it's really enriched it in a way that I don't know if I would have had the same experience if I hadn't been going to it. And sorry, just to say finally, I think that the reason also that I find it really amenable is that all of the theology, all the Catholic theology that I accepted over the Protestant theology that I'd left behind was so clearly exemplified in the traditional Mass. That final doctrine that I had the most trouble with, the sacrifice of the Mass, was just so apparent in the traditional liturgy, and that really struck me, and that was really important for me, and the power of the sacraments working by their own effects rather than by sort of whatever mental influence they have on you, but just by doing the sacrament, you have an effect on the person. That really was an important distinction between the Protestant and the Catholic theology, and I think it's very clear in the traditional form of the sacraments.
Yeah, now I think the TLM, to me, it brings out the vertical dimension so much more clearly, whereas the Novus Ordo sort of overemphasizes horizontal. among human beings. And also just to reinforce what Ben said, I mean, I think he's absolutely right. There's a certain objectivity, so to speak, about the traditional Mass that it's not, again, I'm not encouraged to focus on my own thoughts and words and so on, but to focus on what God is doing for us there on the altar. When I first, I had the same reaction when I first TLM. It's like, why am I just sitting here doing nothing right, for a whole hour? I mean, where are the responses and all that kind of stuff? And then I realized, oh, okay, well, I should just be focusing on what God's doing, right? I don't have to worry about whether I'm doing anything or not at all. So,
yeah. So I remember when I was an altar server for your wedding, Ben, and looking out at the congregation, which was, I guess, a lot of your friends many of whom are your friends and family, many of whom are Protestants, and then your wife Alex's family, who are this, Hispanic family from the South Texas border. And there are a few faces who were very intently praying and very much into it. And then everybody else looked very confused and what's going on?
I wasn't looking that direction, but I can believe it. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe it would be good to talk about how you've dealt with kind of the brokenness in the church that is all around us, because I'm sure that can be a big obstacle that people that want to convert, that they well, one thing that I've heard that happens to converts at times is that they come in and I'm joining the true church, this is the church that Christ established, and sometimes they come in and they're very disillusioned by what they experience, given that the Catholic Church is still a church very much, I think, in need of renewal. So what has your experience been with that in terms of the things that the church is struggling with right now and what you've experienced and the parts of the church that you've been in?
Yeah, I didn't experience that at all myself, because I went in with extremely low expectations, and partly because I'd read enough history, right? I mean, there's this old medieval story which I like a lot. You guys, I'm sure, know it, right? About the man who was going to convert to the Christian faith, and he had to take this trip to Rome, and his priest said, "Oh no, don't go to Rome. It would be a really bad idea." And he went to Rome and comes back. He says, "Okay, I'm ready to join the church." And he said, "Really? Why?" And he said, "Well, I reached Rome. It was so corrupt, so horrible, that it made me realize that this church could have survived only if God's behind it." And that's sort of that was my expectation, right? I mean, I knew that there were lots of problems in the church, and so I was expected to be much worse. Actually, I found it to be, and I just believe that despite all of that, right? This is where faith comes in, right? That despite all the appearances, this is where God is. This is what God's doing, and so that has not really been an issue for me. Now, maybe I do have an issue still with obedience. That's not really easy for me, right? And so I do tend to. Because one of the things you could do in the Lutheran Church is, if your pastor says something you don't agree with, you say, "The Bible says you're wrong, pastor," and you can be very assertive. And as a Catholic, I feel like, well, okay, there's a system of authority here, right? I'm just a layperson, so that I struggle with that. How exactly navigate that, right? But yeah, anyway, no, I wasn't disillusioned, actually.
I came in with similarly low expectations. I mean, I came in thinking, well, if the Pope doesn't have several concubines and he's leading an okay life as a Pope.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, every Protestant knows about the horror stories of the papacy at times. I mean, that aspect of things, the immorality of, let's say the clergy, the disbelief of the laity, it wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. I mean, in some ways it is disheartening at times. But I think the greater difficulty for me has been just, confusion at the top. Like I converted in March of 2013, and Pope Francis had just been elected, and so I didn't really know what to expect. And it's honestly, it's been a very difficult papacy for people converting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's that actually, I mean, that surprises me sometimes when Protestants convert now. I think, well, aren't you deeply scandalized by what seems to be apparent contradictions now in the magisterium, and thankfully, I mean, obviously, I mean, there's ways of understanding why there's not a contradiction going on, why what we're seeing is not magisterial from the Pope. But it's still, I mean, I think it's still, for me, that's actually the much bigger issue than immorality or any issues with the laity. It's just, it feels like being back during the Arian crisis and saying, well, St. Peter, why don't you teach? But I mean, that actually reminds me a little bit of, there was a story of a professor at Princeton who was converting to the Catholic faith. And this was under Pope John Paul II. And somebody asked him, well, why are you converting? He said, well, I just really admire the Pope. And they said, well, he's going to die and they're going to get a new one. And he said, darn, they tricked me.
Yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, I've heard that story too. Yeah. No, that's true. I mean, it was easier under John Paul II or Benedict. I mean, they had their problems too at times, but compared to Francis, it was apparently much more consistent. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that at least strikes me as like a major difference between like Catholic theology and Protestant theology is this idea of like secondary causes. Then the Catholic Church is this really strong idea like God likes to work through what He's created. So the sacraments come through us through created things in sensible ways, and that God works through other people and reveals Himself to us, through other people.
Yeah.
And I think, at least it strikes me, that a lot of the sort of Protestant Reformation was sort of a loss of faith and the fallenness of God's created things, and that you could find God through creation, and this desire to go like directly, immediately to God, as opposed to relying on broken men and broken people to be the arbiter of God, or the arbiters of God through the priesthood, or to rely on God through like the sacraments or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think it goes along with humility, being able to receive what is good from whoever is Pope, despite their imperfections, whether those be imperfections in their sanctity or imperfections in their fulfillment of the Petrine office. But our relationship with St. Peter is through the Pope, and it is very important that we be in communion with the Church of St. Peter. So we can't be led by real problems with the papacy into any kind of schism or heresy in that regard. And that kind of reminds me, there's this I don't know if you've read the book Kristen Lavren's Daughter. I'm probably going to give away the ending, but I think that's okay. It's a very long book.
Yeah.
And the point is not the ending. But there's this one bit where one of the main characters is on his deathbed, and they call the parish priest. And the parish priest has slandered this man's wife, accusing her of adultery. And in some ways is basically the reason for this man's dying right now, is because he provoked this fight between these two men over the man's wife's honor. And so the parish priest comes, and the man who's dying just point blank refuses to receive the last sacraments from the hands of this man whom he hates, and for good reason despises this man. And so he ends up waiting for the bishop to come to give him the last sacraments. But by the time the bishop comes, the man is dead. And so he doesn't receive the last sacraments. It's like, I think it's a real important message for us that, we receive the sacraments from sometimes very wicked men, but the sacraments work because of Christ through these men, whether or not these men be living or dead instruments of Christ. It's Christ who works in us through the sacraments. And when you appreciate that, then you can start loving your bishop, even if you think everything he does of his own will is actually mistaken. But the most important things he does are things that he does by being the minister of Christ. And so those are way more important than whatever he does of his own will.
So I know that you're talking about obedience, Dr. Koons, and a lot of people struggle with the papacy and the idea of papal authority. And so maybe they're drawn actually to consider the Orthodox Church as maybe the true church. Was that ever a live option at all for either of you?
It wasn't really for me. And I've had some Orthodox friends ask me about this, post facto, why didn't you really consider the Orthodox Church? And I think, my sort of simple answer was, one heresy at a time, one schism at a time, right? That, I came out of the, we Lutherans came out of the Latin Church. We were part of the Western Church, right? And we divided from it. And I reached the point of deciding that was a mistake. I need to be part of the church. I have absolutely no genealogical or historical connection to the East, right? So to me to have gone East would have been just a way of sort of thumbing my nose at the Pope. Basically, I don't want you. I'm going to go with these other guys. And that just didn't seem to be right at that point, right? I was going to accept the authority of the church, so at least for us in the West, that was the Pope, and so I was going to go with that. Plus, there were all kinds of other things. As I said, Thomas Aquinas was a huge influence on me. Also, really liked Augustine. I didn't want to give them up, right? And which a lot of the Eastern Orthodox nowadays, sort of insist that you do. And looking back too, the Orthodox Church has been somewhat wobbly on some of the issues like divorce, and even on pro-life issues are not as solid as the Catholic Church has been. So on those kind of issues that had impressed me, contraception, this was one of the things that, I'd come independently to realize that contraception was wrong. And then I looked around and only the Catholic Church is teaching that. So that was another kind of a confirming bit of evidence for me.
For you, Ben?
It's very similar reasons. Actually, I did at one point have a Lutheran pastor who I was talking to about converting to the Catholic Church ask me, well, why not Orthodox? That was one of the few times, though, I really thought about it at all. And basically the same reasons as my father. I thought, this is not the church of my ancestors. This is not the church that they left either. And I just thought I'm Roman through and through in terms of my culture. But then later, I guess, doing some reading about the issue, it didn't seem to me that any of the grounds on which the Orthodox claimed that the Roman Church was mistaken were very credible. And also I thought, there are people who have, Eastern rites, Eastern liturgies, people even under bishops who are perhaps in schism with Rome, but who themselves don't adhere to the schism, right? They think, well, there's the Pope in Rome and he has his jurisdiction there. He has jurisdiction over the whole church. I have my bishop here. My bishop is mistaken about the status of the Pope in Rome, but he's still my bishop. And that seems to me like a plausible position to be in. The further step of then saying that the Pope is mistaken, that always seemed wrong. So I think you can appreciate all kinds of theology done in the East without thinking I need to go under one of these other bishops. but yeah, then things like the filioque, I mean, it struck me as a very difficult issue, but if anything, the evidence was much better for the Roman position over any kind of anti-Roman position. Things about like the universal jurisdiction of the Pope, that seemed actually to have first millennia support. Even if it wasn't something that was very explicit, it was just assumed. And if you looked at the status of whatever the Pope would say in these ecumenical councils, it just seemed like he was being treated as an arbiter for these disputes in a way that wasn't really compatible with the way that certain like anti-Roman Eastern positions would have it.
So I wonder if I could ask you, as we're kind of finishing up the conversation, what advice you have for anyone who's maybe thinking about converting to the Catholic Church?
Yeah, my sense is that there's a million paths to the Catholic Church. It's so hard to generalize and say, here's what you need to do, because people do it for infinite number of different reasons. Gosh, I just don't know how I can answer that question, to be honest. It'd have to be some specific person who has some specific issues that I could then talk about. But obviously, the more you know about history, the more you read about the more you can read of the early church fathers. That will always be helpful, I think.
I agree with that, and I think when I was going into it, I thought there's only one respectable way of becoming Catholic, which is to read your way into it, and to do a very thorough research project about the early church, the medieval church, the Renaissance church, the church throughout all of history, researching all of these different theological issues, basically grounding yourself in scriptural exegesis to a really impressive extent. And, to some extent, that's what we did in college in order to try and help people become Catholic. Like, I remember my senior year, I was spending more time on reading up on St. Robert Bellarmine's arguments against the Protestant positions than I was on my senior thesis. But I don't think that, I think, if you're in college, often that's a means that's available to you to become Catholic. And if it is a means available to you, then I think I commend it, but there's not just one respectable way of becoming Catholic. And there's very few corrupt ways of becoming Catholic.
Yeah.
I used to look down on people who would become Catholic just to marry somebody, but I no longer think that there's anything wrong with that. I think, however you get into the church, even if the way you get into the church wasn't the right way, however you get into the church, it's good for you to be in the church. And I wouldn't worry too much about, have I done things in exactly the right way?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe to narrow that question just a little bit more, do you have any advice for someone who's struggling with that kind of leap of faith that you all were talking about, and kind of crossing the line between sort of what your intellect can do and taking that act of faith?
Yeah. It did help me, I think, at some point to realize that there's just no way that Christ would have set things up in such a way that he would deliver this complex set of documents called the Bible to us and then say, okay, now it's up to each one of you to figure it out and work out exactly what the right theology is and then join appropriate congregations. That just isn't the way that God would work with us, given our finite limitations. And then when you look at even the descriptions of the early church in Acts and in Paul's epistles, it's pretty clear that there were authorities, right, that already were in play there. And so once you realize that, then I think at some point, again, it lifts some burden here. And you realize, wait a minute, I can't figure out exactly what Paul was talking about in Romans 4 at this point. It's so hard, but I don't really have to, right? I can just trust that the church is giving me the right interpretation.
I guess if we're talking about people who really do want to, let's say, enter into the Catholic Church, but they find it difficult to make that act of belief, which I think is difficult. I mean, I guess for myself, I just sort of, I'd done all these certain things, but I just found myself believing at a certain point. I don't think it's an accident, though, that happened in the context of wanting to make an act of devotion, right, to the Blessed Virgin. And I think if you really are serious about discovering the truth to these questions, and also serious about accepting the Catholic Church, should it be true, then having a lively Marian devotion is really important to that. And that doesn't necessarily mean you need to come at it from the kind of fully Catholic way. It can start off in a very simple way. I mean, perhaps you in your theology, you can't accept asking Our Lady for intercession, but maybe you perfectly fine with admiring her, and then, well, you should admire her, right? Like, if you can't say the full Hail Mary, say the first half of it, right? Because that's in the scripture. So, if you give Our Lady whatever honor you believe is compatible with true religion as you see it now, then I think she'll keep helping you.
Yeah. That's great advice. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me about your conversion stories. Hopefully this will be a conversation that can help to bring even more people into the church and to build up the church. So with that, unless any of you all have any last thoughts or contributions, I think we'll call it a day.
Great. Now, thanks, Alex, for bringing us together on this.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Thank you.